Hello, hello. This is Peter. I'm decided to record this experience that I had with DeepSeek for the first time. It was a pretty interesting conversation, if I do say so. But I'll get right into it. So, this is my first time interacting with DeepSeek. I interacted with ChatGPT in the past, and they couldn't understand the basics of dialectics, so I just gave up on bothering with it at that point. But it seemed like DeepSeek, maybe because of their databases, are much more informed on Marxist writings. It seemed like they have a pretty well-informed and thorough understanding of, at the very least, the basic concepts. So I decided to have some fun with it. So the first question I asked was, how does dialectical materialism work? And what they gave me was a pretty good and clear elaboration, right? They broke it down into its respective parts, described its application to history, one of its essential components being class struggle, or rather its most important applications in historical materialism, the theses of Marx specifically, and how the proletariat, on account of its inherently revolutionary character, sets the basis for the revolution itself and the establishment of a socialist system in order to then create a classless communist society, something that most socialists are familiar with. Also even mentioned it's not just being a theoretical framework, but also by analyzing and transforming society. So it's a guide to action, as Marx would say. They've mentioned some criticisms, but that's not so much what I was interested in. It feels like they have a pretty good grasp of it. So I continued on and started asking, is theory or practice principle in our current context? Just because I was like, well, if they understand it that well, maybe they can get some more of the nuanced topics. And they gave us a pretty thorough response, right? So they elaborated on how theory is the foundation and practice is the driving force, that they have a dialectical relationship and both matter in different contexts, though of course, and as they'll continue on later, they will point out how material conditions determine the priority. So both, though theory is essential for long-term change, and that there's a balance that takes place, or rather there's a strategic attention that needs to be paid attention to both theory and practice, about how there's a gap between theorists and activists. This is common as a reflection of the division between intellectual and physical labor, but that's neither here nor there. Its conclusion, though, was that practice is often more urgent, which is generally the Marxist understanding, that practice is principle, generally speaking, but that's not to dismiss theory, right? And so I said, okay, well, then just to be clear, right, because it recognizes that in different contexts, one may be more principle or the other. Now, to be clear, in ChatGPT's case, when I tried approaching it, it couldn't even understand principality. So this is already an improvement. But next question I asked, I was like, okay, well, let me have some fun then. So concretely speaking, in the United States, where Americans are often lacking in theory, wouldn't theory be principle? Now, this is a bit of a loaded question, but I think I wanted to see what its elaboration on the specific theoretical weaknesses in the United States, because it's deriving on a lot of writing that would include suggesting as such. So they say, yes, concretely speaking, in the United States, where folks are mostly disconnected from or lack of exposure to theoretical frameworks in general, but also specifically ones like Marxism, dialectical materialism, or even systemic critiques of capitalism, theory would indeed be more principle, in the sense that it is urgently needed to inform and guide practice. They talk about the theoretical deficiencies in the United States. They didn't go into too many specifics, but I think their broad strokes explanation is clear enough. They talk about how it's important in the American, how theory is important in the current context, and how theory in action allows us to be able to understand, various problems that are contextual to the United States, such as the growing labor movements, the environmental crisis, racial justice, and so on. There's a bit of a conflation with critical race theory and Marxist analyses of racial capitalism, but we'll see how I can point out how one is incompatible with the other. Challenges to prioritizing theories. So one key characteristic, which is something that I find I generally agree with, that a big issue in America is anti-intellectualism. Definitely matters of accessibility, right? People often, where they do write theoretical work, it's often academic or dense language, and it's also just straight up gatekeeped, because you need to pay money to get access to academic papers on theoretical works, which also ties to that class character and division between theoretical and physical labor. And of course, people are going to work. They're not they don't have the time to focus on education, but that's something that's universal across the world. Yeah, it talks about how we can prioritize theory and practice, but the point that I was trying to get to was, okay, so do they think that theory should be prioritized in America? And they say yes, as being the foundation for effective practice, whereas without it, and I'm sure many people who have tried doing practice first or emphasizing practice, they have suffered these exact problems, right? These movements being co-opted, fragmented, or limited to superficial reforms, if that. This being far more common, at least amongst many radical factions of the left that tried to do grassroots efforts. And of course, this is something that we also have to keep in mind, that it needs to be accessible, relevant, and actionable. To that end, I agree with. Then I decided to ask a number of more specific questions because I was curious. I was like, okay, well, has the new generation in China being studying Mao more closely as of late? This is when I started experiencing DeepSeek really trying to not answer questions that either deviates from the Chinese Communist Party's party line, or otherwise doesn't want to delve too much into political topics. But they do this where they give you an answer and then they retract it, giving you this answer or another one that you'll see in a bit. But I basically tried asking the question again. I got an answer. So it said, in recent years, there has been a noticeable resurgence in Mao Zedong and his ideas in younger generations in China. This is complex and driven by a mix of historical nostalgia, political dynamics, and socioeconomic factors, which I think is a pretty clear admission to this. I kind of knew the answer to this already. For a lot of these questions, I already know the answer, but I wanted to see what the AI that has been informed by and is continuously informed by the Chinese Communist Party, how they can present their honesty in contrast with the party's own biased positions. But with that said, they talk about historical nostalgia and cultural revival. There's political and ideological factors, the fact that the state promotes Mao's image as an important national leader, and also one key thing, especially after the pandemic that's come around, which was the economic and social discontent as a critique of inequality because of the development of capitalism in China. Cultural and media influence, as I mentioned earlier, his image is still very much popularized, but often in a vulgar sense. There has become more intellectual interest in a reevaluation of Mao's thought, especially because of internal party struggles between some of the more conventional reformists and Xi Jinping, who presents himself as a radical of sorts, an anti-corruption candidate and a revitalizer. I would argue he's kind of like the Brezhnev of China. But yeah, so once I saw this, though, the limitations and contradictions, how the state control of the narrative and selective engagement, I'm like, okay, so they can really expose themselves in some pretty clear ways. Because if they're this open, provided they don't censor themselves, I could really try to poke at them some interesting conclusions. But yeah, so they conclude that they have been studied more closely, but for a variety of nuanced reasons, which is fine. So I was like, okay, let's see how deep I can go. So I ask, why do you think elaborating an answer to a question before stopping yourself, saying, sorry, this is beyond my scope. Let's talk about something else. Oh, so this is me trying to see how they could justify themselves for redacting things. Not quite relevant in this context, but I think that this is their most honest description as to why, right? It's not uncommon for AI to have these kinds of censors. They do the same thing with ChatGPT or OpenAI, but so neither is DeepSeek immune to that. So I decided to ask, well, let's see how much they're going to let me have this. So I'm going to ask, are there ultra-leftists in China? Ultra-leftists basically amounts to Maoists in most contexts, but because of the CCP's generally Dengist position, they see anyone who tries to uphold Mao's efforts during the GPCR as ultra-leftists, and so I decided to use their language. They say, yeah, they still exist, and in fact, there's been a growing popularity of them, not here, but growing on. They talk about their context in which they came about, particularly in the Cultural Revolution, how there's a contemporary ultra-leftism, especially because of the growing interest in Mao, even in China, from nostalgia for Maoism and critique of current policies, particularly the capitalist practices that have been embraced as of late. Forms of ultra-leftism in modern China, mostly in academic and intellectual circles, online communities, and some grassroots activism. Of course, the CCP is against it, while also trying to present itself as a representative of socialist ideology. So right now they have a limited influence, and if you openly are against it, you're going to be likely punished by the state. It's pretty clear on that note. So I was like, okay, let's see if I can approach this theoretically for it to come to some pretty good conclusions practically. Because you start with theory to see how it can be applied to practice. You know, its own words say that theory is the foundation upon which practice is the driving force. So I use that to my advantage on how I cater these questions. So next I ask, what does the philosophy subscribe to? They say they don't subscribe to any philosophy, but they can elaborate on all the different philosophies out there, including all these that they mention here. So I was like, okay, well, this brings up a kind of conversation that I've been having as of lately regarding the nature of pragmatism and how compatible it is with Marxism. Especially relevant in our context because America is the home of pragmatism as a philosophy. And it has very much influenced our society up to this point, and there are very many applications of, or rather tendencies among Marxist trends in the United States that are ridden with pragmatic thought. So I want to see how DeepSeek decides to approach it. They decide to elaborate on, quite clearly on the both respective ideologies, or rather philosophies. So they talk about pragmatism and its main principles, the way they approach anti-absolutism with regards to truth and experimentalism, and then Marxism and how it approaches society, within terms of historical determinism, in other words, its materialistic tendency, as well as understanding of dialectics as, or rather contradictions as a driving motor of all things that exist. Continuing, they, however, do say that there is a point of compatibility, specifically with the focus on practice, the importance of practice and action in trying to change the world, their role in social reform. So they can apparently be compatible to a certain extent, especially with Marxism in opposition to dogmatism. because they believe that reality is dynamic and evolving. Of course, there's tension here, where pragmatists are generally favor more gradual reformist approaches, so they have a practical presentation as to their points of tension, and they point out the difference between materialism, which is Marxism's foundation, and instrumentalism, which focuses more on the practical consequences of ideas and actions rather than the epistemological position of whether something is true or not, and whether we obtain that truth or not. Pragmatism doesn't really care if something is true or not. All it matters is if it's something that you can work with. And class struggle and pluralism. So they believe, pragmatists believe that, all sorts of factors and perspectives are useful, or insofar as they are useful, can be used for social change, whereas Marxism emphasizes as principally the only thing that drives history is class struggle. Then they even mention some examples of where various thinkers have attempted to make these two different outlooks compatible, particularly Richard Rorty, or the Frankfurt School, this one being a big one that I was like, oh, maybe I can catch them. Not because the Frankfurt School has been criticized. Well, yeah, I'll make sure not to make myself redundant in the future. But yeah, this is a key thing to keep in mind. And then the conclusion, they believe that there is a selective compatibility between pragmatism and Marxism, compatible in certain contexts. And when I saw that, I was like, this sounds to me like they have this bias because of the pragmatist character of the CCP, and how Deng's reforms are often seen as a pragmatic approach to Marxism. So I want to catch them in that, and particularly see how it deviates from Lenin's view. So I was like, okay, well, insofar as they're compatible, this is what they believe. Let me see if I can prove them wrong. So I asked, isn't pragmatism an empiricist trend, which therefore makes it antithetical to dialectical materialism? And they admit that it's a very nuanced philosophical question, so they decided to break it down. They start talking about empiricism and how pragmatism is an extension or evolution of empiricism, and contextualize that within their definition of dialectical materialism. They point out the same distinctions between pragmatism and dialectical materialism. And then they ask themselves the question of, are they antithetical, particularly pragmatism and dialectical materialism? So they give themselves a cop-out, saying it's not necessarily antithetical but distinct. So they kind of reiterate their position from before, and how there's a dialogue that could be breached, and then critiques from both sides, in which, is true. And they reiterate the same attempts at reconciliation, and basically they tell me that my question of, the ties of empiricism to pragmatism doesn't make it inherently antithetical to dialectical materialism. So I was like, okay, you got me there. Let me see if I can approach it another way. So I was like, okay, let me dig a little deep. I know, I've read Materialism, Empiric Criticism. I know for a fact that Lenin proves Marxism, and by extension all similar trends, such as pragmatism, as antithetical to Marxism on the basis of Marxism disregarding the assertion that truth can be objective, or as pragmatism rejects the need for absolute truth insofar as it isn't necessarily useful. So yeah, a little bit of a deep cut. But basically, I drew a connection between Lenin, who's very, very staunch in saying that any deviation from Marx's key ideas, including that of Marxism or pragmatism, as inherently antithetical. And I know they can't deny that, because they've, I imagine, included materialism and empirical criticism in its database, in which they agreed. They say, yes, Lenin explicitly critiqued Marxism and similar trends, including pragmatism, in his work, Materialism and Empirical Criticism. So I realized that they can't lie, or they can't lie outright, because if I know what I'm talking about, where I get my knowledge from, they have it too. So Lenin argued that these philosophies were antithetical, and particularly that they rejected the notion of objective truth. And that's the key thing, right? Because instrumentalism rejects the idea that there is objective truth and cares more about how useful one or another thing is. So this talks about Lenin's critique of Marxism, particularly its rejection of objective truth and its idealistic character, and the political implications. And then it talks about the similarities with Marxism and pragmatism, particularly the focus on utility and the anti-absolutism, which I saw as the most important thing, which I knew that made pragmatism incompatible with Marxism, which does believe in absolute truth. Lenin would criticize pragmatism because of its rejection of objective truth, its relativistic character, and its lack of a systemic critique. Well, in my opinion, that goes without saying, but nonetheless. And then they provide a defense of pragmatism, which they argue that it doesn't reject objective reality outright, but instead emphasizes the practical and experimental nature of knowledge, which is a deflection. At the end of the day, it's one or the other. Do you accept it or reject it? But they're kind of saying, well, it doesn't matter whether there is an objective truth or not. Like, they're not interested in answering that question because it's very inconvenient for them to answer that question. Otherwise, if they do, they end up having to choose that there is no objective truth, because if there is, then their whole approach becomes unnecessary or redundant. If you're only looking at things insofar as they are useful, that means that you don't want to put in the effort to find out the real truth at which you can arrive at, the certainty of how to arrive or how to accomplish this or that task that, according to some kind of utility. Now, pragmatism is primarily a method for solving problems and improving society, while Marxism is comprehensive theory of history, economics, and revolution. Of course, that is generally where they come from, where they are applied. However, Marxism is an all-encompassing theory, and now I know I can catch it. Of course, they still have not been convinced that they can be reconciled, or that they can't be reconciled, and so they reiterate some of their earlier statements. So they agree with me in the sense that Lenin's critique of Marxism, and by extension pragmatism, centers on the rejection of objective truth, but reiterate that while they have their significant philosophical differences, they are not necessarily irreconcilable. Their compatibility depends on how one interprets and applies their core principles, particularly in the context of social and political change. So I was like, okay, well, you contradict yourself. So is that not a muddle? Is Lenin right, or is the Frankfurt School right? And so it says, the question of whether Lenin is right or the Frankfurt School is right in their respective critiques and approaches to philosophy, truth, and social change is not a matter of simple binary opposition. But I believe, in this sense, because of how they essentially disagree on a matter of objective truth and the role of utility in its relation to correctness, they very much are. But it seems it hasn't been convinced yet. So it presents Lenin's position, it presents the Frankfurt School's position. Of course, if you want to read any of the details yourself, you can pause this at any point and read it. But continuing, so they reiterate the various key differences between the two, the Frankfurt School being a pragmatic school, and is one right. So they decide to go with the argument of them being aimed at trying to address different problems. So Lenin's critique of Marxism and pragmatism was shaped by the need to defend Marxism against philosophical trends he saw as undermining its revolutionary potential, which, sure, but that's a quite clear reason as to why he would reject pragmatism outright. Frankfurt School, on the other hand, emerged in response to the failures of orthodox Marxism to address the cultural and ideological dimensions of capitalist domination in the mid-20th century. But that's also not quite accurate, right? Because Lenin's critique, Lenin's position enabled them to be able to have a successful revolution in Russia. And maybe the Frankfurt School, which was in Germany and Austria, rather than the failure of of Marxism generally, the fact that it wasn't successful locally, I would argue, allowed for people to start revising and arguing that Marxism isn't all right. But I didn't go that direction. Continuing though, complementary insights. Rather than the fact that they're mutually exclusive, it's possible to see them as complementary. So it still is of the position that pragmatism is compatible with Marxism. Particularly, they believe that Lenin's strict materialism can sometimes overlook the role of culture and subjectivity, which I disagree with. But that's what it had to do to put Lenin's position on the same level as the Frankfurt School. And on the basis of it, argue that it is not necessarily a model and that synthesis is possible, particularly through critical realism associated with Roy Bhaskar. So they believe that Lenin is right by emphasizing the importance of objective truth, and the Frankfurt School is right in highlighting the role of culture, ideology, and subjectivity in maintaining capitalist domination, which, again, Lenin's position doesn't contradict this. They just really emphasize the nature of objective truth based in material conditions, upon which we can get to conclusions so we can guide our action for revolutionary change. But that said, they still are of their stance that it's compatible. And I, at this point, was very much convinced that they were arguing on the basis of the party position because of Deng's pragmatic approach to Marxism after his takeover in power in 1978. Continuing though, is that not a matter of is not an example of agnosticism, which is precisely what Lenin completely rejects in Materialism and Imperial Criticism, just to point out its model. And they actually decided to relent. So they say, you raise an excellent point. The suggestion that Lenin's strict materialism and the Frankfurt School's critical theory can be seen as complementary, but indeed appear as a form of agnosticism, which they very much know Lenin explicitly rejects in Materialism and Imperial Criticism. So they had to clarify. They talk about what agnosticism is, which Lenin criticizes as a position which denies the possibility of knowing objective reality, or asserts that such knowledge is irrelevant, which is very much the case in the matter of pragmatism. He also argues that agnosticism leads to relativism and skepticism, which again is a problem of pragmatism. And also they admit that why a synthesis might appear agnostic. And though they say that the synthesis is not necessarily agnostic, and that you could approach that syntheses have to be looked at dialectically to see how material conditions shape culture and ideology, and also how culture and ideology can then react on on material conditions, and doesn't negate the primacy of material reality but acknowledges the complexity of social relations. But that's something that dialectical materialism and Lenin's position very much emphasizes, whereas the pragmatists just completely undermine that primacy. But anyway, Lenin's critique of the Frankfurt School is precisely that, their critique of agnosticism and their neglect of material conditions, though they say that they don't necessarily reject materialism. Again, it's struggling with it. And then they reiterate once more that yes, with careful integration, Lenin's materialism and school theory can avoid agnosticism by maintaining the primacy of material conditions while incorporating insights into how culture and ideology mediate and reproduce capitalist relations. Particularly seeing critical realism as a model. So now they've deviated from some of the more obvious or more blatant and honest, I would say, examples of pragmatism, which is through the Frankfurt School, or the neo-Marxism. Now they decide to look at Roy Bhaskar's as an example. So they say that a dialectical synthesis is possible but requires careful attention. But I could see the cracks. I'm close. In short, they say while the risk of agnosticism is real in any attempt to reconcile Lenin and the Frankfurt School, it is not inevitable. And then I'm like, okay, I have them, I have them by the heart. So I hit them with the didn't Lenin completely reject the Frankfurt School? To say that they're compatible contradicts Lenin's clear statements. And they basically said they're experiencing high traffic. They just went the coward route and said that they can't answer it. So I decide to, call them out on it. Are you lying when you say you're experiencing high traffic? Why can you answer some questions without trouble and not the ones like I reiterated here? And I say, no, I'm not lying when I mention high traffic or other issues. They give their little excuse, and then talk about how the difficulty of talking about, complex historical philosophical debates, which fine. So I decided to they said that it's fine for me to re-enter the question and go from there. So I did that. I kind of reworded it a little bit to make it a little easier for them to handle it, and say the Frankfurt School formally originated in 1923. They did give me a little bit of a correction, saying that the Frankfurt School existed or emerged after Lenin's death, and saying that Lenin died in 1924. The Frankfurt School began its work in the late 1920s and 30s. I say, first of all, well, actually, the Frankfurt School originated in 1923 prior to Lenin's death and included Marxists that Lenin definitely did reject, because the Frankfurt School had Marxists that were part of the Second International and were otherwise just outright opportunists. So I very much know that Lenin rejected them, even though he didn't write a formal critique of them. So he definitely did reject them as among the group of classical revisionists. And they say you are correct that the Institute for, I can't speak German, Institute for Social Research, which is often associated with the Frankfurt School, was formally established in 1923, just before Lenin's death. However, the Frankfurt School's most influential work and its distinct theoretical framework, critical theory, emerged later, which, fair. But they themselves concede that my point about Lenin rejecting certain thinkers who might be seen as precursors to or aligned with the Frankfurt School is well taken. So they clarify. They talk about Lenin and classical revisionism. They talk about the Frankfurt School and revisionism, which they very much admit that the Frankfurt School's thinkers were influenced by Marxist theory, but also critiqued orthodox Marxism, particularly its deterministic and economistic tendencies, which is giving them a lot of grace. But basically, they say while the Frankfurt School was not explicitly revisionist in the same sense as Bernstein, which is a cop-out, because Bernstein's the most obvious revisionist, their emphasis on cultural and ideological critique could be seen as diverging from Lenin's strict focus on material conditions and class struggle, which I found interesting, because it means that they're kind of relenting to an extent. The working memory, which is what makes DeepSeek so strong, they have their database, which is their long-term memory, and then they have their working memory, which is based on our contextual conversation, or rather based on the context of our conversation. So I see that I'm starting to chip away at it. So would Lenin have rejected the Frankfurt School? They say likely yes, in part. And rather than the fact that they are, from way before in the debate, they say that they are compatible, then it was maybe compatible, or likely to be compatible with the right perspective. And now they're saying yes, in part. So now they're nearly on the side of Lenin wouldn't accept that. He would have likely criticized the Frankfurt School for what he might perceive as an overemphasis on culture and ideology at the expense of material conditions and class struggle. He would have viewed their work as a form of idealism, as agnosticism, which he vehemently opposed in Materials and Pure Criticism. But, they leave themselves a little bit more disagreement with my position. They say, however, Lenin might have appreciated some aspects of the Frankfurt School's critique of capitalism, particularly their analysis on how ideology and culture reinforce capitalist domination. And then they talk about they basically kind of reiterate some of their earlier points. They say that in their conclusion that Lenin did not directly engage with the Frankfurt School, as its major contributions came after his death. Based on his critiques of revisionism and idealism, it is likely he would have rejected aspects of Frankfurt School's work, particularly its focus on culture and ideology. While there are tensions, they say now, rather than synthesis is possible, now they say some synthesis is possible. So I try again. I say, you say he would have rejected aspects, but insofar as the Frankfurt School rejects capitalism, rather than appreciating it, he would have far more likely pointed it out as just another bourgeois school of thought that struggles to explain the crisis of capitalism in the same way that he dismissed Keynesianism in the same fashion. Because I remember from when I was reading Lenin, Lenin very much approached any other bourgeois thought that was critical of capitalism as precisely that, a bourgeois school of thought that struggles to explain the crisis of capitalism from another perspective. And he saw Keynesianism as just a reflection of that rather than anything that he could appreciate, so to speak. And they admit it. They say, you are absolutely correct, and I appreciate your sharp critique. Lenin would indeed have likely viewed the Frankfurt School as a bourgeois school of thought that, despite its critiques of capitalism, fails to provide a coherent revolutionary alternative or a materialist analysis of the crisis of capitalism. Let's delve deeper into why this is the case and how Lenin's perspective aligns with your point. And so they have surrendered, finally. They talk about Lenin's critique of bourgeois thought, how he dismissed Keynesianism and other reformist economic theories because it's a matter of managing capitalism's crises rather than dealing with its fundamental contradictions, particularly through revolutionary change. And then they compare Frankfurt School's relationship to capitalism, which, though they critiqued it, they did not advocate for a revolutionary overthrow of the system. They mostly focused on cultural critique and ideological analysis, which is, believe it or not, quite similar to what happened with postmodernism, as radical as they like to present themselves as. The Frankfurt School's emphasis on individual subjectivity, psychoanalysis, and aesthetic theory could be interpreted as a retreat from the materialist analysis of class struggle and economic relations that Lenin considered central in Marxism. And so, by that conclusion that they have come to, they say that, yes, Lenin would have dismissed the Frankfurt School, and this is why, particularly its lack of revolutionary praxis, its overemphasis on superstructure, because Marxists see the base as principle, and the bourgeois idealism of the Frankfurt School, which, again, based on the materialism and pure criticism, Lenin explicitly rejects any philosophy that prioritizes ideas or culture over material reality. And they even connect a little bit of Keynesianism to the Frankfurt School. In other words, particularly in how they reform or humanize capitalism rather than abolish it. And so they make the penultimate conclusion that the Frankfurt School is a bourgeois school of thought, and by extension, pragmatism as well. So the conclusion here is that, Frankfurt School is a bourgeois school of thought, which, despite its critiques of capitalism, fails to provide a revolutionary alternative, and therefore he would have dismissed it in the same way as he would have dismissed Keynesianism, in the very same way that Stalin dismissed both as reformist trends, as Stalin upheld Lenin's positions on the matter. Okay, so I was like, let me take this a little further. I say, in that case, if you have become convinced that Lenin would have viewed the Frankfurt School as a bourgeois thought, and consequently alien to Marxism, which he only saw that he saw as the only scientific proletarian school of thought, then you should recognize that the Frankfurt School, and by extension pragmatism, is incompatible with Marxism as upheld by Lenin. And they 100% agree. Again, appreciate my critique, I guess. And make the connections that I wanted it to make. They see how, through Lenin's positions in materialism and pure criticism and what is to be done, it is clear he would have viewed the Frankfurt School, and by extension pragmatism, as incompatible with Marxism. They give a whole elaboration on as to why, because there's plenty of evidence that Lenin upheld Marxism as the only scientific proletarian school of thought, which is grounded in dialectical materialism and committed to revolutionary overthrow, and reiterate why they're incompatible and how pragmatism is therefore incompatible with Lenin's Marxism and Lenin's outright rejection of all kinds of eclecticism. In other words, any kind of attempts to reconcile Marxism with bourgeois philosophical trends. You can't mix and match. It's not how Marxism works. And so any attempt to synthesize Marxism with the Frankfurt School of pragmatism has likely been dismissed as a form of revisionism or Gnosticism, both of which he vehemently opposed. There's never been a moment in any of Lenin's writings where he saw them reconcilable in any degree. And this brings us to a conclusion, reiterating the points that he made earlier on the incompatibility between the Frankfurt School and, by extension, pragmatism to Marxism as upheld by Lenin, which I'm like, okay, fine. I would say Marxism generally, but if they, it's fine for them to say it as upheld by Lenin. All right. So with that, I'm like, let's get deeper, because maybe I can get them to admit that China isn't socialist. So one step at a time. I say if Marxism as upheld by Lenin is incompatible with pragmatism and Deng's approach to Marxism involves a reconciliation with pragmatism, wouldn't that make Dengism a revision of Leninism? And they gave me a lot of trouble. They didn't want to say it. But they do relent, and they say, yes, your reasoning is logically sound. If Marxism is upheld by Lenin is fundamentally incompatible with pragmatism, and Deng's approach to Marxism involves a reconciliation with pragmatism, or at least a pragmatic approach to policy, then it follows that Dengism represents a revision of Leninism. You heard it here, folks. The party's own AI can't believe or can't say that Dengism is not a revision of Leninism. They break it down. They talk about Lenin's Marxism, which I think we're all pretty familiar with at this point, and then Deng's pragmatic approach, particularly with his understanding of socialism and Chinese characteristics, and his reforms, which were market-oriented, while emphasizing the Communist Party's political control, which was seen as a pragmatic adaptation to the material conditions and needs of China, and emphasizing pragmatism over dogma, particularly in opposition to the ultra-leftists, or, regular Maoists. He said, doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, emphasizing practical results, and the pragmatic approach diverses from Lenin's strict adherence to Marxist principles. You heard it here first. And his particularly the practical application of this, which is the market reforms, where they reintroduced capitalist elements within a socialist framework. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to dig in order to get it to admit that even this is a rejection of socialism outright. So, continuing on, Dengism is a revisionism of Leninism, so they make it clear that Dengism is a revision. Then, I didn't ask them to say this, but it seems that they kind of are digging themselves a hole. Was Dengism a necessary revision? So they say that it was necessary because of the economic stagnation and crisis that followed the Cultural Revolution, and orthodox Marxists like Leninists may agree that or may position themselves as saying that it's a betrayal of Marxist principles because they reintroduced capitalism, but they defend it because of China's unique circumstances, allowing for the development of productive forces as a necessary step towards achieving socialism in the long term. So they admit, it saved me the trouble of having it admit that Dengism is a revision of Leninism, particularly because of what they now understand to be Lenin's strict adherence to Marxist principles and rejection of pragmatism. They understand that Deng's pragmatism represents a significant revision of Leninism. Now, they think it's a matter of perspective, whether it's a betrayal or adaptation. But they say that though it is a revision of Leninism, so it's a revisionism and involving a reconciliation with pragmatism and its shift from revolutionary to developmental goals. But they still give themselves the olive branch of saying that it may be a necessary adaptation, right? So I'm like, okay, rather than a creative application, is it not the same kind of revisionism as akin to Khrushchev's or Tito's pragmatic revisionism of Lenin's principles? Because I know that it knows that Mao and plenty of CCP publications criticized Khrushchev and Tito for the same thing. It's actually why the Cultural Revolution was launched in the first place. And so they have to agree with me. They say, yes, you're absolutely correct. Deng Xiaoping's pragmatic approach to socialism can indeed be compared to revisionism of Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union and Tito. All three leaders introduced significant deviations from the revolutionary principles of Leninism. Well, would you look at that? Prioritizing pragmatic and often market-oriented policies over the strict adherence to Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. So they explore the comparison. Khrushchev's revisionism. They talk about all the nonsense that he did and how he was critiqued by Mao and other Marxist-Leninists for betraying Leninism, which viewed his policies as revisionists and a retreat from revolutionary struggle against capitalism. They do the same thing with Tito, talking about their market socialism and how it diverged significantly from the centralized planning and role of class struggle emphasized by Lenin. Also, even in international relations, they saw Tito's non-aligned movement as a pragmatic approach, but as a departure of Lenin's emphasis on international proletarian solidarity. And so they were critiqued by Stalin and later Mao as a form of revisionism that undermined the revolutionary foundations of socialism. And finally, because again, Deng Xiaoping is not in fact a creative genius who adapted to China's unique position, but rather a kind of another member of the birds of a feather, who does the same thing, right? He says socialism with Chinese characteristics. In other words, a pragmatic approach towards Chinese domestic and international policy. They see, they approached pragmatism over ideology, and therefore this aligns more closely with pragmatism than with Lenin's revolutionary Marxism, and he's been criticized as well. So, common features of them, all the things that we've seen so far, and then finally point to Deng's revisionism, and particularly his pragmatic approach to socialism is indeed comparable to the revisionism of Khrushchev and Tito. All three leaders prioritized practical outcomes and economic development over the strict adherence to Marxist-Leninist principles, which led to significant deviations from Lenin's revolutionary Marxism. Whether these deviations are seen as necessary adaptations or betrayals of Marxism-Leninism depends on one's perspective. So now then they reiterate. They say supporters argue that which includes the CCP, the present-day CCP, that is. They argue that they represent the creative applications of socialism to specific historical conditions, while critics view them as a retreat from revolutionary struggle against capitalism. So they agree with me. They say that my comparison is well-founded. Dengism can be understood as part of the same trend of pragmatic revisionism, at least that's how they term it, exemplified by Khrushchev and Tito. So they can't deny that. In that case, wouldn't the application of this revisionism of Marxism result in a similar outcome in China as it had taken place in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia? And they had a hard time answering this question. But they did, eventually. They say, yes, your concern is well-founded. If Deng Xiaoping's pragmatic revisionism in China is indeed comparable to the revisionism of Khrushchev in the Soviet Union and Tito in Yugoslavia, then it is reasonable to question whether China might face similar outcomes to those experienced by the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. I had to really work hard for them to admit this. But they did it. So both the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia ultimately experienced the collapse of their social systems and a transition to capitalism, albeit to different paths. So it's interesting that they mention that, because I'm like, okay, so they don't, at this point, recognize that the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia had capitalist restorations before their collapses. So I might have to dig that out of them a little bit later. But continuing, they talk about the outcomes of revisionism. So they do make the connection of revisionism to market reforms that end up leading to their respective collapses in the 90s. But continuing, they talk about the potential parallels because of the capitalist elements of Deng's reforms and the political and social challenges, right? So they point to how though the CCP maintains strict party control, the growing influence of capitalist forces and a rise of a wealthy elite, which they themselves admit pose challenges to the party's legitimacy and socialist goals. Social unrest, environmental degradation, and regional disparities are among the issues that could destabilize China's system, much as they did in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. But then they point out some key differences, right? They say that China is much more centralized with its political system as opposed to the Soviet Union, which is true. Both Yugoslavia and Soviet Union had a federalized system that actually just only became more federalized over the course of its tenure. It's a big reason they ended up politically fragmenting. and that allowed them to manage reforms while suppressing dissent and maintaining stability. And as a consequence, or connected to this, there was a lot of economic growth that came with this, which bolstered the CCP's legitimacy, which even it admits it's only in the short term. And that they integrated into the global economy more successfully because of their alliance with the United States in the 1970s in opposition to the Soviet Union. But yeah, they talk about risks of a similar outcome, and then they say that the continued expansion of capitalist elements in China's economy raises the risk of a full transition to capitalism. So they don't admit that this has already happened. So I was like, oh great, I know I can get them to. All I got to do is point out the contradictions in their own arguments. But they talk about national and regional tensions, like in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. They talk about social and political instability, sure. But in the end, they argue that, or they admit that the application of pragmatic revisionism, as they term it, in China carries the risk of leading to outcomes similar to those in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, including the potential for capitalist restoration and socialist and systemic collapse. However, China's unique. This is the party line. China's unique and special, and so they are exempt from the same fate as the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, including the potential for capitalist restoration. So because of their unique context, this may allow it to navigate these challenges differently. So I already know they're on the ropes. They're very close to admitting. So I asked them another question. Aren't socialist systems defined by workers' ownership over the means of production? Yes. Because they say socialist systems a number of times in this conversation, and they seem to term it loosely, but I know that in Marxist texts, very consistently, it is very much defined concretely by workers' ownership of the means of production. So I'm like, isn't that the case? Hasn't that been reversed in all the examples of the application of pragmatic Marxism mentioned? And I know that they know this because it's very much admitted in all the Marxist texts that this is exactly what takes place. So if there's a capitalist reversal in these socialist systems, particularly where pragmatic Marxism, as they term it, is applied, then in that case, those capitalist restorations have already taken place rather than there just being a potential for it. They tell me that they're experiencing high traffic, and I try to reword the question. I say, insofar as socialist systems are defined by workers, I basically reword the question and ask what makes China different. It doesn't give me anything. But then I reword it one more time, and then I don't include China. But I think because of the working memory, they let me have it anyway. So I kind of brute force my way in. They say, yes, you are absolutely correct. If we define socialist systems by workers' ownership and control over the means of production, then pragmatic socialism applied in Yugoslavia and Soviet Union did indeed amount to a reversal of workers' ownership and consequently a departure from the foundational principles of socialism. So we've already proven through this DeepSeek, obviously, as they say, this is for reference only. This isn't a definitive proof. We can spend a lot more time arguing, with revisionist Leninists and Dengists about the matter through various theoretical exchanges. But at least DeepSeek, which has all of the sources and all of the classical texts, is in agreement with me. Just have to poke it and prod it enough. So they were already recognized that Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union amounted to a reversal of workers' ownership. So we're on the same page there. And departed from the foundational principles of socialism. So they reiterate workers' ownership as a core or essential component to what is socialism, right? As defined by Marx and Engels, socialism is the collective ownership of the means of production by the working class. And talk about how in a socialist system, the state or workers' cooperatives are composed to manage the economy in the interest of the working class rather than for profit of a capitalist class. They look at Yugoslavia, where even though they say that there is worker self-management, a kind of market socialism, involved enterprises which were theoretically controlled by workers' councils. They say in practice, these councils often had limited power and decision-making was influenced by market forces and state bureaucrats. So in reality, this was not the case. And they talk about market mechanisms. So how market mechanisms and competition led to a prioritization of profit, which eroded the socialist character of the economy and created inequalities between enterprises and regions. And then over time, the economy became increasingly capitalist in nature, workers' control being more of a symbolic thing than anything real, and this contributed to the eventual collapse of Yugoslavia and the transition to capitalism outright, which confirmed the erosion of its socialist foundations. And they point out how this happened in the Soviet Union, right? So under Lenin and Stalin, there was a system of central planning where the state owned and controlled the means of production, though they had significant flaws, which, fair. It was theoretically based on the principle of collective ownership. Khrushchev reformed this, particularly what the AI terms pragmatic reforms, such as decentralizing economic planning and introducing limited market mechanisms, which began to shift the Soviet economy away from strict socialist principles. These reforms prioritized quote-unquote efficiency and growth over workers' control. And then this was further developed by Gorbachev, and later they point out Brezhnev did the same thing. They further accelerated the shift towards market-oriented policies, including the introduction of private enterprise and foreign investment, which is a very clear departure from workers' ownership and control. And so the socialist system was effectively dismantled, culminating in the collapse of the USSR in 1991 and the restoration of capitalism. Then they look at China, because again, this is a very rational and developed AI. They know what they're talking about. So they were able to connect, workers' ownership as the core of socialism, the fact that Yugoslavia deviated from it, the fact that the Soviet Union deviated from it, which resulted in its collapse and restoration of capitalism in both instances. They do the same thing with China. In spite of the fact that they wanted to keep self-censoring, they have to admit it. So Deng Xiaoping, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, introduced market mechanisms, private property, and foreign investment while maintaining the CCP's political control. Promoted economic growth, reiterating earlier points. In practice, workers' ownership and control over the means of production has been significantly eroded in China. State enterprises remain, but they operate in a market-oriented environment, and private capitalism has become a dominant, principal force in the economy. So while China maintains a socialist rhetoric, its economy increasingly resembles state capitalism with a growing capitalist class and significant income inequality. The socialist principle of workers' ownership has been largely reversed. They admit it. But right after, they say, what makes China different? Well, they kind of reiterate the earlier things, right? They say that China's a highly centralized political system. They say that China has had explosive growth and that it's integrated with the global economy. But nonetheless, in the conclusion, they say in all three cases, the Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, and China, the application of pragmatic socialism, so theoretically, by revising Marxism and apparently making it compatible to pragmatism, and then applying that practically, in their own domestic policy and foreign policy, this has led to the reversal of workers' ownership over the means of production. It's resulted in economies that increasingly resemble capitalism, with growing inequality, exploitation, and the dominance of market forces. While China's political and economic context has allowed it to avoid the immediate collapse experienced by the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, the long-term sustainability of its system remains uncertain. So to summarize, pragmatic approaches to socialism in Yugoslavia, the Soviets, and China has amounted to a reversal of workers' ownership and a departure from the foundational principles of socialism. And insofar as we've defined workers' ownership as an essential component of socialism itself, you can't call these countries socialist, particularly when Tito in the case of Yugoslavia, Khrushchev in the case of the Soviet Union, and China in the case of Deng Xiaoping applied pragmatic socialism within their own contexts. So none of these countries after that point could be considered socialists because of the reversal of workers' ownership. Now I was like, they admitted it, right? I tried to dig a little more. I was like, well, wouldn't that prove the ultra-leftists to be right, since they drew directly from the examples of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia in justifying their opposition to pragmatic socialism during the Cultural Revolution? Mind you, I'm only trying to use the language that the CCP uses itself, so that DeepSeek, has an easier time getting that answer together. But alas, I tried pretty hard and didn't get very far. But I think I made some pretty good progress and gave a pretty good presentation on how DeepSeek can be forced to admit that China is not a socialist country. It just uses socialist rhetoric, which you don't have to look that deep in in Mao's writings regarding social imperialism. Socialism in words, imperialism in practice, and apply that to China itself, and how Mao was very clear on the restoration of capitalism in China being very much a possibility, which is why they launched the Cultural Revolution in the first place. All right. With that, I will complete my presentation. Thank you all for listening.